Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling something we all think we know, but honestly, we've kind of totally misunderstood it. We are taking on a comprehensive, scholarly deconstruction of idolatry. Now, if you spend any time at all in modern culture, you hear the word idol thrown around constantly, right? We use it to describe pop stars, or maybe an unhealthy obsession with our smartphones, or a toxic pursuit of wealth and status. But here's the thing. If we really want to understand the ancient texts, we have to recognize that these modern, psychological definitions simply did not exist for the original authors. Not at all. To the ancient mind, idolatry was a terrifying, concrete, and highly regulated reality. So, in this deep dive study, we're going to rely on a strict historical study of the original languages. We're going to strip away centuries of metaphors and modern systematic theology to look at the raw, structural, lexical, and historical data of the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world. We want to discover what literal biblical idolatry actually was. And honestly, just as importantly, we need to figure out what it wasn't. Here is the roadmap for our breakdown today. We'll start with the lexicon of idols, move into objects and spirits, understand why it was a distinct category of sin, analyze Paul's figures of speech, and finally, build our final framework. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the lexicon of idols. Let's unpack that ancient vocabulary. Our analysis really has to begin at the bedrock of any serious academic study, and that means looking at the foundational Hebrew and Greek terminology. If we want to understand what the authors were legally prohibiting back then, we have to look at the exact words they chose to write down. In the Hebrew scriptures, one of the primary terms they used is pesel. This word actually derives from the root pasal, which literally means to carve or to cut. The texts we find in Exodus and Isaiah reveal that this specifically denotes a graven, carved, or sculpted image made of wood, stone, or metal. It's a very physical thing. Then, when we move over to the New Testament, the Greek text relies heavily on the word eidolon. This is derived from idols, which means form or appearance. In the context of Hellenistic Judaism, it represents the physical, material form of a false deity. What is absolutely vital to grasp here, and I really want to stress this, is that in their original contexts, these words were not abstract concepts. They weren't feelings or priorities. They were strictly physical, manufactured cult objects. They were tangible items taking up actual physical space in a temple or a home. The biblical definition of an idol rests on this really fascinating foundational tension. The authors simultaneously recognize the object as a physical reality, something you can actually go up and touch, while at the exact same time declaring it an absolute spiritual non-entity. As the psalmist writes in Psalm 115, verses 4 and 5, their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they don't speak. The Hebrew authors here are establishing an absolute ontological boundary. By ontological, I mean a complete separation in the very nature of reality between the living creator and inanimate matter. They are literally mocking the physical object, pointing out the pure absurdity of bowing down to something that was just crafted by a human artisan a couple of days ago. It's an ontological vacuum. The wood and stone possess zero inherent divine life. That brings us to section 2, objects and spirits. Let's talk about the supernatural conduit. So you might be wondering, if the prophets were mocking the wood and stone, why was the sin taken so incredibly seriously? Why all the intense laws? Well, this brings us to the second phase of our deconstruction. To the ancient mind, an idol was never merely a piece of visual art. It was something far, far more dangerous. Historical data from the cuneiform texts of the ancient Near East reveal that a statue did not magically become a god the moment a woodworker finished carving it. It required an explicit, highly guarded ritual connection to the supernatural realm. This historical data details the Mesopotamian mis-pi, or mouthwashing ritual. To put it into modern terms, think of it like installing an operating system into a brand new piece of hardware. First, the physical object was crafted by the artisan. Second, the priest performed the mis-pi ritual. During this elaborate ceremony, the priest would actually declare that the gods themselves had fashioned the image, which effectively wiped away any trace of the human artisan's involvement. It was a conceptual overwrite. Finally, the localized spiritual being was explicitly invited to inhabit or manifest through that stone or wood. Through this meticulously engineered process, a carved block of wood was conceptually transformed into a literal portal for an actual spiritual entity. This wasn't just pretend, this was an interactive, supernatural exchange. And the biblical writers were acutely aware of these pagan rituals. When they peeled back the material veneer of the wood or stone to explain what was actually happening behind the scenes, they consistently pointed to a very active, very real spiritual reality.
According to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, quote, "The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God." Paul is arguing here that the physical material of the idol isn't inherently special. Remember, it's just wood or stone. But actual idolatry is occurring because the human intent behind the cultic act is to interface with a real spiritual being. The historical consensus of the early church was very clear. Physical idols were inextricably linked to a dark supernatural infrastructure. You couldn't have one without the other. Now, a profound semantic shift actually occurred in the ancient world regarding these spirits, and it's super important to catch this. In classical Greek literature, think of the writings of Homer and Plato, a daimon was not inherently evil. It was essentially a neutral lesser deity, a guardian spirit, or even a personification of fate. The philosopher Socrates even famously claimed to have a personal daimon guiding his intellect. However, according to historical textual data, when Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into the Greek Septuagint around 250 BC, they did something revolutionary. They took Hebrew words describing worthless idols and territorial spirits, and they translated them into Greek using the specific word daimonion. In doing so, they completely demonized the neutral Greek concept. They established the Jewish and New Testament worldview that these entities behind the idols were not helpful, neutral guardians at all. They were deceptive, malignant spiritual forces actively warring against the Creator. Let's move to Section 3, a distinct category of sin. And guys, it is not just a synonym. Because our modern culture no longer builds literal statues in the town square to invoke demons, we have massively watered down the word idolatry. We use it as a generic umbrella term for basically any moral failure, right? Or anytime we put a hobby or job ahead of God. But historically and textually, idolatry is a highly specific legal and cultic offense. It is a category all on its own. It is absolutely not just a synonym for generic sin or things like sexual immorality. If idolatry were simply a generic synonym for doing something wrong, the biblical virtue lists would be completely redundant. But they aren't. According to Paul's letters to the Corinthians and Galatians, he uses highly structured lists to catalog transgressions. Notice his use of a polysyndeton list. That's a rhetorical device that links items repeatedly with the word nor to show strict categorized separation. He writes neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor slanderers. The text explicitly distinguishes between these categories. A thief violates property rights. A slanderer violates someone's social reputation. Someone who is sexually immoral is committing an ethical sin of the flesh. But an idolater specifically engages in cultic devotion, sacrifices, or ritual association with an idolon, a physical representation of a false deity. The structural and lexical separation here is absolute. They are entirely different crimes. And this strict boundary didn't just start with Paul. It actually originates deep in the foundational legal codes of ancient Israel. According to the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, in Exodus 20, sins are structured precisely by their target. The first table contains vertical, cultic sins specifically against YSH. This includes the strict prohibition against manufacturing a physical idol, a pestle. The second table, on the other hand, contains horizontal ethical violations against your fellow man, things like murder, theft, and perjury. Under this ancient legal framework, a person could absolutely commit a horizontal sin, like stealing a neighbor's sheep or lying, without ever once entering a pagan temple to commit the highly specific vertical cultic sin of idolatry. They are tracked as separate offenses. So, treating idolatry as a blanket synonym for general wrongdoing completely erases the precise taxonomy of the ancient text. It totally muddies the waters. With absolute academic clarity, we can define that literal idolatry is a discrete cultic sin. It fundamentally required two core things, a physical representation and an orientation toward a non-YHW spiritual entity. Without those specific elements, you simply have a standard ethical violation. It's still a sin, for sure, but you do not have the literal crime of idolatry as the ancient courts and original authors would have understood it.
Which brings us to Section 4, Paul's figures of speech. Let's resolve the textual tension we find in the New Testament.
Any rigorous academic study has to address the anomalies in its data, right? And we definitely have a major one here. It's the Apostle Paul who rigidly defines idolatry as a literal cultic sin in his vice lists, but it is also the exact same Apostle Paul who famously connects idolatry to internal, psychological greed. How do we resolve this textual tension without collapsing his specific definitions into generic metaphors? According to Paul in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 3, verse 5, he commands his readers to put to death internal vices, ending the list with covetousness, which is idolatry. To understand what he's doing here, we have to parse the original Greek grammar. The lexical data shows Paul uses a specific relative clause here, hetis estin. This doesn't mean a literal equation. It functions as a qualitative identifier, meaning of such a kind as.
Paul is not saying the noun covetousness is literally identical to a bronze statue. Rather, he is powerfully arguing that covetousness operates in the exact manner of idolatry. Think about it. A covetous, greedy person bypasses the physical temple entirely, but they perform the exact same internal transaction. They are placing their ultimate trust in material wealth to guarantee their security, rather than trusting the Creator. It's a behavioral parallel. To really understand how Paul operates, we have to remember his very unique dual background. Historically speaking, he is a highly trained Pharisaic legal scholar, but he is operating out in the field as a rhetorical missionary in a pagan Greco-Roman world. So he maintains a dual approach, depending entirely on the context of the specific letter he's writing. When he's writing legal and ecclesiastical catalogs, like we see in 1 Corinthians 6, his definition is strictly literal and cultic. His function there is to set clear boundary lines for community fellowship. He needs to dictate who is literally attending pagan temple festivals and making sacrifices. But when he writes internal and ethical exhortations, like in Colossians 3, his definition shifts to being analogous and rhetorical. His function here is deeply pastoral. He desperately wants to show his new converts that their old pagan habits of submitting to rival cosmic powers can sneak right back in under the guise of everyday internal vices like greed.
Paul actually leans heavily on a rhetorical device known as metonymy. Metonymy is a figure of speech where a thing or concept is referred to by the name of something closely associated with it. According to Paul in Philippians chapter 3, verse 19, he describes certain individuals whose God is their belly. Notice he doesn't even use the word idol here. He goes straight to using the word God. Now, obviously, he is not suggesting these people are literally bowing down to a physical stomach. He is describing a tragic state where biological appetites and earthly desires have completely usurped the Creator's sovereign position in their lives. It is a brilliant metaphorical extension. It borrows the horrific structural gravity of literal cultic idolatry and applies it to internal human rebellion to show them just how dangerous their appetites have become.
For a bit more historical context on why Paul specifically links greed with idolatry, we just need to look at the number 19. According to the historical accounts in Acts chapter 19, a massive citywide riot breaks out in Ephesus. And why did it happen? Because the Apostle Paul's teachings were literally destroying the local economy. The historical and archaeological records reveal that the Ephesian Temple of Artemis was not just a religious center where people prayed. It actually operated as the supreme bank and safe depository of all of Asia Minor. The entire city's massive financial engine was dependent on the manufacturing and selling of silver shrines for the goddess. In the ancient world, literal cultic idolatry and massive institutionalized financial greed were deeply intertwined. You couldn't separate the temple from the bank. This perfectly explains why Paul rhetorically fused them together for his first-century readers. To them, the connection was obvious. All right, we made it to Section 5, the final biblical framework. Let's bring all of this together. After an exhaustive academic deconstruction of the original languages, the ancient Mesopotamian rituals, the structural vice lists, and the rhetorical strategies of the Apostle Paul, we can establish very concrete rules for what this ancient sin actually was. Based on our historical study, literal idolatry is 3 specific things. First, it is object-oriented and cultic. It strictly requires a tangible, manufactured artifact set apart within a distinct ritual framework. Second, it is explicitly linked to supernatural realities. It involves an intentional orientation toward an active spiritual force, what the Greek texts call a daimonion. The worshiper genuinely believes they are interfacing with an actual presence. And third, it is a legal violation of an exclusive covenantal monopoly. It is a formal, documented breach of the vertical relationship established between YHW and humanity, shifting fidelity over to a rival cosmic authority. These are the strict functional mechanics required for a sin to be classified strictly as literal idolatry in the ancient Near East. Conversely, we absolutely must firmly draw the boundary lines on what it is not. Literal idolatry is not a broad synonym for general sin. If you commit a horizontal social crime like stealing or an ethical sin, you are not committing the specific cultic sin of idolatry. Second, it is not a purely inward psychological state. While unchecked ego or internal rebellion obviously precedes the action, literal idolatry requires external material execution. So that modern hustle culture burnout or unhealthy obsession with your smartphone that we mentioned at the beginning of the explainer, that might be a serious ethical flaw, and it might be something you need to fix, but it is not literal idolatry. And the third, it is not merely a modern metaphor for personal priorities.
When Paul links greed to idolatry, he is using a rhetorical figure of speech to elevate the severity of greed. But a greedy merchant isn't committing literal idolatry until he actually performs a ritual to a specific deity. If you strip away the physical object and the supernatural demonic element, you are left with a standard ethical violation, not literal biblical idolatry. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to consider today. If literal ancient idolatry wasn't just about people foolishly loving statues or simply having bad personal priorities, if it actually required a meticulously engineered conduit to an active rival spiritual being, how does this change our modern reading of the text? We so often read ancient history through our safe, comfortable, secular, modern lenses. We soften the edges. But the original authors lived in a world teeming with supernatural realities and rigid covenantal laws. Perhaps, to truly grasp the immense weight of these ancient warnings, we need to dare to look at the text through the exact same rigorous supernatural lens that they did. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. Stay curious, keep studying, and I will definitely see you in the next explainer.